Hi, Misha here, and kind of going back through some older guns, revisiting them, and I kind of felt like it was time for a Luger video. And I do own a couple of nice Lugers now. I never really got into them heavy, because by the time I was old enough to buy handguns, Lugers were already starting to get pretty pricey. That's actually why I got into P38s, because in the late 90s, P38s were pretty affordable, all things considered. But nevertheless, over the years, I've picked up a few. Actually, I've had this one for a while. This came out of a friend's collection. This is a World War II so-called Black Widow style. That's just what the importers call it, with all the late features. The black grips, black magazine, no strawing, just an all blued finish. Really the end of P0 production. This one I picked up about a year ago. This is a relatively early Great War, World War I. And I actually used this to replace a 1918 that I had. So this is pretty much standard German military, Imperial German military issue with the wood grips, the wood-based magazine with the silver kind of nickel style body. But you know, these are nice guns. But probably my favorite Luger that I own is this one over here. And it's by far the least collectible, least desirable. This is my Finnish Pist 08, complete with Tikakoski 120mm barrel. So I thought we'd talk about these, why collectors, at least in the past, kind of snub these, and why I think that's very short-sighted of them. And actually why of the three Lugers on the table, and even of most Lugers, one of these is technically quite rare. So it is a little baffling that a lot of collectors just don't. But that's okay, because I do. I was thrilled to pick this up years ago, and it'll probably not be one I sell any decade soon. So with that, why don't we just talk about how the Luger came to Finland. Setting our Pist 08 aside for a minute, let's talk about these two guns. The Russian 1895, or just M95 Nagant revolver, chambered for 7.62 Nagant. As you can tell, this is a non-refurb. And the Spanish Ruby in 7.65 32. This is a French World War I contract gun, and this is a cheapened amalgamation of John Browning's designs, like the 1910. So Finland first started fighting for independence in 1917, and then a civil war kind of rage. I'm going to tilt you down just a bit. Throughout 1918. By 1919, they were self-determining and kind of getting the commies out, and they had a young military. Well, they had a good number of Mosin Nagants and were able to purchase more from European allies. Handguns they really didn't have a lot of, aside from this revolver here. They had a few. It is a double single action design, but it's old school, using the loading gate. I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the Nagant. You have to even use a rod to push out your cartridges. Not exactly a modern, efficient handgun. It fired its own unique round. Not a good double action trigger pull. The only thing you'll say about it, it is durable. So some of these would continue in Finland. But following World War I, surplus guns were everywhere, including these. France had purchased a large number during the war, but they were a stopgap measure gun, little 32s. They served alongside others in France, like the Savage, as well as their older 1892 revolver. After the war, though, France really didn't need all of these, so they agreed to sell quite a large quantity to Finland to equip their young army and also be sidearms for their civil guard officers. So in a pinch, this did okay. It is simple enough, easy to maintain, if nothing else, but the quality of manufacturing was not high, and interchangeability of parts, including like magazines, not great. So it was a stopgap. It would work, but it had some issues, and of course it's firing 32, which is not anyone's choice for powerful round of the year. What they really were interested in, and this kind of came about after the German training of some Finnish officers, was the Luger. This seemed the way Finland wanted to go. But following the Treaty of Versailles, things changed in Germany. DWM would eventually be broken apart. You would have Siemens would be the one company allowed to make guns, but there were quite a few restrictions, including barrels had to be under 100 millimeters, which that's okay because the World War I Lugers had 3.9-inch barrels anyway. But they fired 9mm, just as this one is chambered for here. That was no longer allowed to be built. Instead, they had to revert to the older 7.65 Parabellum, 7.65 by 21 cartridge to comply with the treaty. So the Finnish government, the Finnish army, liked the gun, but did not care for the caliber. They did find that Belgium could manufacture 9mm Lugers for them, but the price was going to be high, and the delivery time was going to be pretty far out there. And the Finns, they needed handguns ASAP. Meanwhile, Germany was willing to sell 30 caliber guns with the barrel at about 98 millimeters. Some sources say 95. Doesn't, you get the idea. Shorter barrels. Kind of basically commercial grade ones with German selector markings at a very reasonable price, and because they had pretty much stock on hand and a factory ready to go, they could deliver quite quickly. So in the end, they ordered from Germany, and they would have looked like this pistol, but would have had the 30 caliber barrel, so slightly more neck down, and maybe a little nicer fit and finish because peacetime construction. But they would have had wood grips, blued finish, typical Luger toggle action. You know the drill. They had German selector markings, German proofs, German serials. They would have used the same 8-round mag. And generally speaking, nice, high quality gun. See? They also did have lugs for a shoulder stock, which is a little interesting that wasn't something that the Treaty of Versailles mandated be removed, but anyway. So they were building these guns, and the first batch of 2,000 were delivered in 1923 to the Finnish government. Hence, they were called Pistol 1923, or Pist 23 for short, and later sometimes just M23. And throughout the 1920s, they would receive about 8,000 presumably 4 batches of 2,000 each. Plus, a few more would be private purchased by military officers, as well as some civilians, as well as some in the government, some in law enforcement, what have you, and a few more were given away as kind of deal sweeteners with other military packages. So we don't really know grand total how many ended up in Finland, but I don't know, let's just say, roughly 9,000 to 10,000 total. And again, most would have been in the 30 caliber, although some 9mm came over through other means even this early. But, well, they liked the Luger, and it actually performed quite well. Finland wanted to manufacture its own handgun domestically. So this project started in the late 1920s. In fact, the earliest prototypes were called the L29. This would become the famous Lottie L35 pistol, but that's kind of for another video. But you would think maybe once the L35 went into production, that would spell the end for the Luger in Finland, but far from the truth. Here's my Lottie L35. Some kind of mistake it for a Luger. It does have a similar profile, but very different gun. I'll revisit these in a totally different video, but yeah, with the, actually it was the KP31, the Suomi, the submachine gun, plus then later the L35, they really kind of pushed 9mm Parabellum to be a standard again within Finland. Originally they had wanted it a decade earlier, and now they're going to it. They actually did try doing a submachine gun in a 30 caliber, but yeah, it didn't work out the way they wanted. So with that, you would think the L35 would replace the Luger. They had a few, it was the frontline gun. But in reality, manufacturing of the L35 took a lot longer. In fact, it wasn't even ready by the time of the Winter War in November of 1939. And VKT, later Valmet, that produced these, never really could make enough of them. Plus, they were found to be a little weaker than desired. To that end, fewer than 7,000 were delivered to the Finnish Army and Civil Guard, later to be formed as the Finnish Defense Force, the FDF, meaning that the Luger would remain in frontline service and use, actually, in some instances, through the 60s, and the ones that survived wouldn't be surplused out until the 80s or even 90s. So yeah, it certainly had a second life, and that's actually where we get our Pistol 1908, or Pist 08, or M08 from. Aside from a handful of factory 9mm Lugers, these all started off as 30 calibers. And many would remain with a 30 caliber barrel throughout their entire service. There wasn't a big push to rebarrel these, but the idea was, well, some of these are getting shot out anyway, and we're using 9mm. So in Finland, they started manufacturing barrels. Tikka made most of them, although I think it was Forgotten Weapons and a few other places have also reported that Mishaco made some too. What's interesting is it's a different barrel profile. It's a very straight barrel with a very sharp shoulder here where it screws in. And two lengths seem to have been made. A 96mm, so just under 4 inches, about 3.8, and 120mm, which is just under 5 inches, and that's what we have here on this barrel. And it does have the T for Tikka proof mark. And so this was done sometimes by the Army, but often by the owner of the pistol, the officer who had it. And otherwise the guns would pretty much remain unchanged. But of course the problem is the same they had with the L-35. They're trying to use the same hot SMG ammo from the KP-31, the Suomi, in the Luger and the L-35. So it was pretty hard on these old guns, especially considering a lot of them had quite a few miles on them. This is why Finnish guns essentially don't have matching serial numbers. It's the same instance as with their Mosins. A lot of the numbers were either scrubbed or just simply mismatched as parts got replaced because we have a limited supply of original M23s. So of course, as ones break down permanently, they will salvage parts from them. So this became a standard, either the M23 or the M08, during the Winter War and through the Continuation War. And after that, at the end of 1944, the Army, which had kind of incorporated the Civil Guard, showed only about 4,000 Lugers in inventory. Now, some of these had been taken home by soldiers, some had been hidden away in caches throughout the countryside. Again, Russians' fears. But many had just been lost, either destroyed through use or lost in the field through attrition. And by the early 50s, we were down to closer to 3,000. Again, many were lost. Many wore out during practice training, what have you. So the numbers are dwindling quite quickly. This one here is kind of a later refurb. It has phosphating to the receiver, which is, I think, very interesting. Now, originally these had wood grips. Then they would put wood grips with unit discs in them. And then they would go away from this during the wars, going back to just standard wood grips. And it's unclear about the plastic grips. They definitely show up on these quite frequently. Some assert that this was done post-World War II. They purchased plastic grips, maybe from the East Germany, who was making new ones, or maybe just surplus ones from wherever. Others say no, that the original wooden grips are just destroyed when the importer brought these in, and so they purchased plastic grips to put them on. And it probably is a little bit of both. Either way, wood grips in the harsh conditions of Finland wore out. Same goes for the original magazines. This one has a later style. Looks to me like an East German production type mag, but either way, you know, new mags have to be acquired for pistols because magazines are a wear part. And you can imagine by the time these got here in the 1980s or 1990s, they were a jumble. They had different parts from different pistols. They had, you know, a Finnish blued barrel. They had phosphating on the receivers. Some of the original German parts were blued still. They had replacement grips, replacement mags, all that stuff. And this is why collectors really didn't care about them. They were just jumbled together mutts. They would much prefer a gun like this. It's all matching, all original Finnish from World War I, or even more of that Black Widow we looked at earlier. But I tend to differ. In fact, as you saw earlier, we've actually shot this one. And I picked this up relatively cheap. The guy knew what he had, but he said it's not matching, you know, yada yada, non-original Finnish, so sold it as a shooter gun. And I, you know, don't mind shooting in it occasionally. But I had actually been looking for a Finnish Luger with the Finnish replacement barrel, either length, but I preferred the longer one, so it worked out fine. And the reason should be obvious. It's a different variant, and it has a boatload of history. I mean, this was, for all intents and purposes, the first Finnish sidearm from the early 20s until well after World War II period. And I love the fact that it has a refinished frame and everything. These also received the SA stamping. And later on, some would receive a new sight. If you notice, this front one is very squared off, very different from our German sight. In fact, let me lay this here so you can see the barrel length difference. I'm going to set you down just for a second. I'll line these up just so you can see how much longer the barrel is. Why not? So that's neat. And to go along with that, the rear sight was also modified. If you look at the German here, you notice it's a pretty narrow gap between the notch. Hopefully I'm getting some of this on camera. I try. Well, on the Finn M08, you'll notice that notch has been opened up a great deal. And that's for easier, faster target acquisition and to work with the larger front sight. And I'm sure also to recalibrate it for 9mm vis-a-vis the original 30 caliber. So those are two major modifications, plus the barrel, the finish, and the markings. These can be found with other markings too: police, prison, some government ministries. But I would say SA is the most common. And because the L35 here maybe didn't work out quite as well as they'd hoped, it really did give the Luger in Finland a much longer life than it might have otherwise had. You can see they're kind of similar length and everything there. So yeah, a lot of history there. A lot of history. And because so many were lost through attrition, this is actually a very rare gun, if you think about it. There's probably only a couple of thousand in the world today. Maybe even several hundred left that are true Finn. And that's why I always thought this was a really super cool, super unique gun, and never quite understood why collectors didn't give it its just due. But, you know, that worked out well for me years ago because I was able to pick one up for like $600 at a time when German examples were bringing, you know, $1,500. So, no complaints here, and I don't plan on getting rid of it. It's exactly what I was wanting. And it goes very well with my Lottie to kind of form my very small Finnish pistol collection. That's why I just felt like revisiting it. It's a really fun story, and there's all kinds of cool variants of these because they were never really standardized, or the way they were treated was never really a standard. So finishes, barrel lengths, calibers, even grips, magazines, all of this can change. Again, this will drive a collector nuts perhaps, but on the flip side, it means you can buy one without really worrying about it. Serials don't match? That's probably correct. Grips are plastic, not wood? Yeah, it's correct. At least how it was sold here is surplus. It's kind of a low worry gun. If physically it checks out, mechanically it works, it's got a good bore, hey, you're good to go for that SA marking. But even the SA wasn't put on all of the ones, so just because it lacks an SA, if you see one with like a T-marked barrel but no SA, it's probably correct too. So they're kind of a relaxing Luger to collect, and hence kind of the title of this video. But I will revisit the Lottie L35 soon as well. So anyway, let me know what you think. Do you have any kind of Lugers that maybe other people weren't interested in that you just love, or any thoughts on these? Feel free to comment below. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, please check out the link to our Patreon. This is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.